Hello and welcome to UI Automation with Studio X. In this first demo, we'll focus on the basics of user interface automation. More specifically, we'll interact with this application right here. In doing so, we'll be using the basic building blocks of UI automation in Studio X, the Use Application resource, and the Type Into and Get Text actions. WUI is a desktop application used for recording transactions. It's a good place to start working with user interface elements. Basically, every button, field, text piece, and checkbox is a UI element, and there are several ways to interact with them. We're going to simulate making a deposit transaction by inputting a value to Cash In input field, another to the On Us Check input field, and then we're going to hit Accept and display the transaction number. So let's open Studio X and create a new task automation project. We'll name the project as UI Automation Basics and give it a description. The new project has all the resources ready. We're going to select the Web App Activities category from the left panel and start with the first building block of UI automation, the Use Application resource. When we're using multiple applications, we'll use one card for each. In our case, we're just going to use the desktop application for this demo, so one resource is enough. Now that this is added, we have to indicate the application that we're looking to automate. A thumbnail of the application validates that the selection is successful. Keep in mind that this is informative only, and it will not be updated with our next actions. We can now proceed with adding the second building block of our automation, an action. All actions are available here in the Activities panel. For this demo, we're going to use two Type Into activities, one Click activity, one Get Text activity, and one Message box. So let's start adding them one by one. You can add activities in several ways. By clicking the plus icon in the workspace, by double-clicking the activity in the Activities panel, or by dragging and dropping the activity that you need into the workspace. Now, we're going to drag and drop the first Type Into activity. Next, we have to indicate the target of this activity. For this, the application is highlighted together with a helper menu that will walk us through the selection process. Let's select the Cash In input field. Studio X will automatically add a target and an anchor. Now you might be thinking, what are these? Well, the target is the UI element that we're looking to use in the process. Anchors, on the other hand, are UI elements helping us in identifying the target more specifically. In our case, the anchor is the label of the editable field. The whole point of the anchor is to ensure stability and the correct identification of the target. This one is good enough because it won't change. Everything looks good, so let's just confirm the selection. Now that we've selected the element, we have to instruct the activity on what is the value that we want to insert. A small comment here. Type Into is an input activity, because we're using it to input data to a UI element. Data doesn't necessarily mean a value. A simple click or check is also a way of inputting data to a UI element. In our case here, we can use the plus icon here or a double click on the entire field, like this. Now we're going to add a value of 1000 for the Cash In input field and hit Save. Next, we'll add another Type Into activity. We're following the same process. Select the input field, check the target and anchor, and confirm. Next, we're going to add a value of 200 for the On Us Check input field and hit Save once again. We know that user interfaces may be navigated between different elements by using keyboard actions. Studio X allows us to do this with the keyboard shortcut activity. Now here's a cool part. If we click Record, we'll capture the Tab key to navigate from one element to another, the Enter key to confirm actions, and even record the combination of Ctrl+S to save our files. The order can be adjusted at any time, and we could also delete a recorded key if we don't need it anymore. For our demo, we don't need to use the keyboard, so let's just right-click the activity and select Delete to remove it entirely. The next step is to add a click activity to accept the deposit transaction. Both the target and anchor are OK, so we'll just hit Confirm. Alright, any previously added activity can be edited at any time from the Options menu of each card. Let's enter editing mode for our second activity card. By doing so, we're resumed from the last step that we left off, with a target and anchors are OK message displayed. Keep in mind that anchors are not mandatory. Still, we recommend using one anchor for every target of a UI element. However, we could add up to 3 anchors for each target. Adding multiple anchors is needed when our process cannot reliably identify the target. At the same time, more anchors don't necessarily mean better reliability. Anchors can be removed at any time by using the Remove button. Targets could also be removed entirely, with all the assigned anchors being removed as well. Let's select our input field again and confirm. As you can see, the transaction number of this deposit was generated. To get this transaction number, let's use a getText activity. This is the first output activity that we're using. We're getting something from a UI element, and therefore we are dealing with an output activity. We are indicating the target. And this time, a warning is being displayed. No anchor automatically found. Once again, anchors are not mandatory. But let's select one as a good case practice. The Helper menu indicates that everything is OK, so we can confirm the selection. Now that we have identified the transaction number, let's save it for later use. We want to make sure that the transaction number has been stored successfully, so we're going to display it with a message box activity. Here, we're going to use the value that we saved earlier. Let's run the workflow, and we can see that our values are being inserted in the input fields. The Accept button is being clicked, and the transaction number is being displayed in a message box. Notice that the number in the message box is the same as the one in the application, so this can be considered a success. We can now save our Studio X project and exit. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back to the UI automation lesson. In this video, we'll be working with the recorder to go through the same process as earlier, using the same building blocks, but this time considerably faster. Let's begin. Just to recap, we're going to simulate making the same deposit transaction by inputting a value to the Cash In field and another value to the On Us Check field. We're then going to hit Accept and display the transaction number. A new Studio X task automation project is ready. We're going to select the App or Web Recorder feature. And we can start recording. The Recorder menu is going to be highlighted for us, and we can start recording the steps that we're looking to automate. Just like in the previous demo, we have to first indicate the application that we're going to automate. This will add an application card for us. You can see it here. Next, we will simply execute the steps in our process, interacting with the UI elements, and the steps will be captured. Look, by selecting the Cache In input field, a target and an anchor have been added for us, and we only have to input the value for it and confirm. The activity has been correctly identified and created for us. Let's select the next input field, input the value, and confirm. Let's also add a couple of keyboard shortcuts before hitting accept. You can do so by simply inputting key actions like Tab or key combinations like Control-Save. Since we don't specifically need this for our demo, I'm just going to remove the keyboard shortcut activity card and move on. Next, we'll click the Accept button, and so the Click Activity card is ready for our process. However, when we're selecting the transaction number, we can see that this has been identified as a click activity. This is not what we need, so we're going to delete it and specifically pick a Get Text Activity type from the selection menu. And here it is. Notice how the card is once again generated for us. After our steps were recorded, we can save and return to Studio. You can see how the entire process has been generated for us. Let's scroll all the way down and add a message box activity here for displaying the transaction number. Because we did not previously save the transaction number for later use, this value doesn't exist here. Let's quickly do that from the Get Text Activity card. Alright, time to run the project. The input values have been entered for us, the transaction number has been displayed, so we can hit OK to finish the task. At any time, we can manually add any new activities, delete or edit them. For example, we can add an anchor to the Get Text Activity target, just as we did in the previous case. We can even use the recorder again to capture new actions. If we choose to do so, we first have to select the step after which we want to resume recording. In our example, we're going to resume from the message box activity card. And the recorder menu is back. But this time, the application card is already here. Let's add a click action on the Cancel button and run the project. Everything works as expected. We're at the end of this video on the capabilities of the recorder. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next demo. Welcome back to the UI automation lesson. We now have a good command of the basics of UI automation. We saw how the Unified Target Framework works in UI automation in a reliable way. It's time to take this further on more complex scenarios. We're going to use the building blocks of UI automation in Studio X again. But this time we're going to use two desktop applications, Excel and the Bank Teller app. Our Excel file has a weekly deposit transactions sheet. This provides us with all of the data that we need in our automation process. Basically, each row represents a deposit transaction, so each value in the table will be added to the Bank Teller app. After inputting the values, the robot will hit Accept, then we'll retrieve the generated transaction number and store it in Excel. We'll start by automating one transaction. Then we're going to make it repeat for all of the rows in the Excel file. Like always, we'll start with a new task automation project in Studio X. And we'll use the same two building blocks of UI automation for each step of the process, the resources and the actions. This time we have two applications in our process, Excel and the Bank Teller app. We'll need one resource for each of them. Let's first add the one for the Bank Teller app. We'll point to the double UI and the thumbnail will confirm that our selection is successful. Then we'll select the Excel file. With the resources ready, let's start adding the activities for automating the steps. We're going to start with Type into Activities, one for each value. First activity is going to select the Cash In input field. Keep in mind that with every selection we make, Studio X is running the target application for us, so the source of our selection is highly reliable. It's basically simulating running the process and identifying the UI elements. After confirming the first input field, we can instruct it to use the first value of the initial transaction. We're going to follow the same process for the next two Type into activities. Select the UI element, confirm it, and instruct it to get the required value from Excel. The Excel file is available for us in this menu because we've indicated it on the resource. Let's edit one of the activities to have a look over the Advanced Settings menu of the target and its anchor. This menu is going to highlight all of the selection methods that are being used for our target, as well as for our anchor. These methods are backing up each other to ensure a correct selection of the UI elements that we're using. Although they're highly reliable, you have the option to edit these methods individually. All web pages and desktop applications have different pages, menus, and functionalities. We call these states because changing the page will change the appearance of the UI elements. Let's see what happens and what we can do about it. We're going to manually change the transaction type to withdrawal. Then we'll edit the second type into activity. We can notice how the search for target and anchors fails because we're not in the deposit transaction page where we initially selected our elements. The helper menu indicates that it did manage to identify some input fields. They're red because they don't belong to the original selection. It's given a certain idea on finding duplicate input field elements, but these are not the ones that we're looking for. Since we know the cause of this error, let's pause the configuration and get back to deposit transaction type. Our selection works as expected now, so let's just confirm our selection. Let's add a click activity now and accept the transaction. Next, we have to use a getText activity so that we can extract the transaction number. We'll select the target and anchor and instruct the activity to save the value in Excel. Now that we have all of the activities we need for the first deposit transaction, let's run the project. Our automation will take the input values from Excel, enter them in the Bank Teller app, and accept the transaction. We can see that the Excel file has been updated with the transaction number. It's the same one as in the application. And this concludes our demo on the advanced capabilities of UI automation in Studio X. See you in the next video on troubleshooting. Welcome back. This demo will help us understand how Show All Matches works in identifying all of the similar elements identified by each validation method used for target and selectors. During the selection of the UI element, or while editing an existing selection, all of the selection methods will be visible. And for each of them, you can use the Show All Matches feature here by clicking the eye icon. By using it for every validation method, you can see all of the matches for that validation method highlighted in yellow. This feature is available for both Target and Anchor. It's recommended to use this feature when you're trying to decide what would be the most reliable UI element that could be used for your selection. And this concludes our lesson on UI automation. Thanks for watching and happy automation! Welcome to this demo on UI automation. This video is about image selection mode and how it could help us in situations in which there are no UI elements that can easily be selected as targets or anchors. Let's start by adding a resource and identify the application that we're going to use. Next, let's add a click activity. In order to select the target, we're going to simulate a scenario where no obvious UI element targets are available for us to select. In such cases, we can use the image selection mode. This applies for selecting a target or an anchor. We're going to highlight the cache in label as target. Obviously, in a normal scenario, we would just add an anchor if the selection wouldn't already do that for us. But let's just use image selection mode for the sake of this demo. One day, this might come in handy. Before confirming our selection, let's check the settings menu of the target. You can see that the only validation method used for our selection is the image method. This is the same for the anchor. By running the process, we can see that our click is successful. The image selection mode is also available in editing mode of our selection. By deleting the previous anchor and target, we can do the selection again. We're going to use image selection mode and highlight the first input field this time. Our image method used for validation is able to isolate the input field and even identify similar items. Adding an anchor with the same image selection mode will help us by clearly identifying the UI element that we're looking to use. We can now confirm and finalize the editing process. And that was all for the image selection mode. See you next time. Welcome back to UI Automation with Studio X. In this demo, we'll use the Check App State activity to identify the correct state of an application that we're looking to automate. Every desktop and web application has different pages, menus, and features. These are considered application states. For successfully automating tasks that are using UI elements, we sometimes need to make sure that the application is in the correct state. In our case here, the application has different transaction types. We can see a deposit transaction state, a withdrawal transaction state, and a split deposit transaction state. Each of them has unique page titles and input fields. We're going to simulate automating a simple type into activity in the first input field of the deposit transaction process. The challenge has to do with the fact that the application opens up by default in the withdrawal transaction type. Let's start our task automation project in Studio X. A resource is already added, since this is the mandatory first step for every UI automation. We're now going to add a type into activity and select the input field that we're working with. Our task is to enter a value of 100 in this field. Let's simulate the app starting in the withdrawal transaction mode and run the process. By running the workflow and having the application in a different state than the one we used in the building process, an error will occur. The error is going to provide context and a couple of thumbnails to help us understand what went wrong. We can now stop the process and acknowledge the failed execution. Let's see how the Check App State works. We'll add the activity and indicate the state that we need to use for our task automation. Because we're not in the desired state by default, we're going to pause the selection configurator and switch to deposit transaction type. Next, let's add a target to the page title and an anchor to the logo above. With this, our task automation process will know that this is the state that we're looking for. Let's then move our previous type into activity in the Do If Target Found step. This type into will be executed only if the correct state of the application is identified successfully. Let's also add a set of instructions for the scenario where we're not in the correct state by clicking Show Not Found block. First, let's add a message box to acknowledge that we're not in the correct state. By having the application set to withdrawal mode, we can run the process and see what happens. Since our process is now aware of the state that we're looking for, a message will be displayed. And just as we wanted it. We can now continue by adding a click activity to change the state to deposit transaction. Let's also display a message that validates our state switch. The last step is to input the desired value in the Cash In input field of the Deposit Transaction menu. We can search for the type into activity and configure it, or simply copy and paste it from the previous step. Now that we've duplicated our desired action, let's quickly enter editing mode and validate our selection for the correct state. The editing mode also detects that we're in the incorrect state. Let's pause the configurator for a bit and switch to the desired state. Our UI element is identified successfully. Let's set our application in the initial state and run the process. Because we're in the withdrawal mode, a message box is prompting us that we're not in the correct state. We acknowledge the message and our click activity is switching to deposit transaction mode. A message will validate the success of switching the state. Once we acknowledge this as well, the input field is being filled in with the value that we need. And this is it for using the Check App State and working with different application states. Until next time.